Dear listeners, welcome to this delightful audiobook presentation of a classic cozy mystery in the tradition of the great Agatha Christie. Settle in with a cup of tea and allow yourself to be transported to the charming English village of St. Mary Mead, where sharp wits and keen observations unravel the most puzzling of crimes. We present to you Miss Marple and the New Year's Eve Crime. Enjoy the tale. Chapter 1. The Village Celebrations. In the quiet English village of St. Mary Mead, where thatched cottages huddled along winding lanes and the church spire rose gently above the elms, the last day of 1952 dawned crisp and bright. A light frost silvered the hedgerows, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke from cottage chimneys. It was New Year's Eve, and the villagers were preparing for their cherished annual gathering at the village hall, a tradition that drew everyone together in a warm display of neighborly affection. Miss Jane Marple, that mild, elderly lady with soft white hair, pale blue eyes, and an unobtrusive manner that caused so many to underestimate her, sat in her small sitting room knitting a pale pink baby jacket for the vicar's wife's expected child. From her window she could observe the high street without appearing to do so. The postman on his rounds, Mrs. Hartnell hurrying to the butcher's with her basket, young Tommy Pratt delivering newspapers on his bicycle. People are very much the same everywhere, Miss Marple murmured to herself as her needles clicked steadily. And in a village one sees them at close quarters. There is nothing like village life for showing human nature in all its variety. The evening's festivities were to be held, as always, in the village hall, though much of the arrangement had fallen to the energetic Mrs. Price Ridley, who prided herself on her organizational abilities. Invitations, though in truth no formal cards were needed in St. Mary Mead, had gone out to all the usual residents. Colonel Bantry and his wife Dolly, Miss Marple's dear friends, would act as hosts in a loose sense. Dr. Haydock, the village doctor, had promised to attend despite a busy day. The young artist Lawrence Redding, who had taken the old forge as a studio, was expected, and Mr. Clement, the rather mysterious newcomer who had recently purchased Gossington Hall, had accepted with polite enthusiasm. The vicar, Leonard Clement, and his lively young wife Griselda would certainly be there, as would the formidable Colonel Prothero, who rarely missed an opportunity to express his strong opinions on any subject under discussion. As dusk gathered, villagers began to make their way along the frosted paths toward the hall. The building itself had been decorated with paper chains in red and green, holly branches above the doorway, and a modest Christmas tree still twinkling in one corner. Inside, the gramophone stood ready with a stack of records, waltzes, foxtrots, and a few lively modern pieces that the younger set favored, and long tables were laid with plates of sandwiches, sausage rolls, mince pies, and a large glass bowl of non-alcoholic fruit punch. Nothing stronger was served. This was, after all, a respectable village occasion. Miss Marple arrived a little after 8, her knitting bag over one arm and a warm shawl about her shoulders. She paused at the door to greet Dolly Bantry, who was flushed and cheerful in a bright red dress. "Jane, my dear, how good of you to come. Isn't it all looking lovely? Mrs. Price Ridley has surpassed herself." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Indeed she has, Dolly. Such a pleasant turnout. Everyone seems in excellent spirits." The hall was already filled with chatter and laughter. In one corner, Colonel Prothero, a tall, ramrod-straight man with a bristling mustache and a voice that carried, was holding forth to a small, unwilling audience on the subject of boundary fences. His opponent in the discussion was Mr. Clement, the newcomer, whose quiet, precise tones contrasted sharply with the colonel's bluster. It was common knowledge that the two men had disagreed over a strip of land adjoining Gossington Hall, and the argument showed no sign of abating. Near the fireplace, young Lettuce Prothero, pretty, fair-haired, and rather vague, stood chatting with Lawrence Redding. The artist, dark and handsome in an unconventional way, was laughing at something she had said. Lettuce's stepmother, Anne Prothero, elegant in a simple black evening dress, watched them from across the room with an expression that might have been amusement or something more guarded. Mrs. Price Ridley bustled about, ensuring that plates were replenished and glasses filled, while Griselda Clement, radiant and slightly disheveled, helped serve sandwiches and exchanged merry remarks with everyone. Dr. Haydock moved among the guests, offering cheerful toasts with his cup of punch, and the vicar attempted with limited success to steer Colonel Prothero toward less contentious topics. As the evening progressed, the gramophone played on and couples took to the floor for dancing. Miss Marple, seated comfortably near the tea urn, observed it all with quiet interest. She noted how Lawrence Redding's eyes followed Lettuce, how Anne Prothero's smile grew a little fixed when the girl laughed too loudly, how Mr. Clement withdrew slightly whenever the Colonel's voice rose in renewed argument. At 11:30, the records were paused and attention turned toward the wireless set in the corner. Big Ben's chimes would soon mark the arrival of 1953. The guests formed a large circle, arms ready to link for Auld Lang Syne. Just before the countdown, Colonel Prothero announced that he needed a breath of fresh air and stepped outside through the side door that led to the garden. No one thought much of it. The Colonel was known for his abrupt comings and goings. The chimes sounded. Voices rose in song, cheers, and embraces followed as the new year arrived. Outside, a modest display of fireworks, organized by the scouts, crackled and bloomed briefly against the dark sky. But when the song ended and the circle broke, Colonel Prothero had not returned. At first it was assumed he was still outside admiring the fireworks or perhaps indulging in a quiet cigar. Minutes passed. Lettuce glanced toward the door with mild impatience. Father said he'd only be a moment. Dolly Bantry suggested someone should check. Dr. Haydock offered to go. Miss Marple, ever observant, rose quietly and accompanied him, along with Lawrence Redding and Mr. Clement. They found the Colonel in the garden, slumped against the old stone wall near the spent fireworks. At first glance, he appeared merely to have sat down for a rest, perhaps overcome by the excitement or the cold. But when Dr. Haydock knelt and examined him, his face grew grave. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "The Colonel is dead." A swift examination revealed no obvious injury, but the doctor's experienced eye detected the signs. The faint bitterness about the mouth, the unnatural stillness. "Poison," he murmured. "Almost certainly digitalis. His heart was weak, you know. A large dose would have acted quickly." The joyful beginning of 1953 had become in an instant a tragedy. Amid the shocked silence that followed, Miss Marple's mild blue eyes rested thoughtfully on the garden path. The empty punch glass still clutched loosely in the Colonel's hand, and the faces of those who had gathered behind them in the doorway. In the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, a murder had been committed beneath the very nose of celebration. Chapter 2. Initial suspicions. The morning of New Year's Day dawned gray and still. A thin layer of frost clung to the churchyard grass and the windows of St. Mary Mead. Inside Miss Marple's sitting room, a small fire crackled while she sat knitting, her needles moving with the same steady rhythm as the day before. On the table beside her lay a cup of tea and a plate of shortbread, untouched. Her nephew, Raymond West, up from London for the holidays, paced in front of the hearth. "Poison, Aunt Jane? In the middle of a village party? It's monstrous." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Digitalis, Dr. Haydock believes, from foxglove most likely." The Colonel's heart was already weak. A strong dose would mimic a natural collapse. "Very tidy, really." Raymond stopped pacing. "Tidy? Someone murdered him under everyone's noses." "Precisely," she said and returned to her knitting. "That is what makes it interesting." By mid-morning, Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham. Tall, thin, and perpetually irritated, he set up operations in the village hall and began calling witnesses one by one. His first interviews were brisk and suspicious. Mrs. Price Ridley, still wearing yesterday's best hat, declared she had been everywhere and nowhere serving punch. "I had to keep the bowl filled, Inspector. People kept coming back for more." Lawrence Redding admitted he had refilled the colonel's glass once, but only because he asked me to. Lettice Prothero, pale and red-eyed, said she had been dancing most of the evening and had not noticed her father leave the room. Anne Prothero, composed but distant, stated she had spoken briefly with her husband at 11:30, then joined the circle for the countdown. Mr. Clement, the newcomer, explained he had been arguing with the colonel about the boundary fence until 11:45, when Prothero had stormed off saying he needed air. The vicar, Leonard Clement, confirmed he had been fetching more records from the vestry between 11:40 and 11:55. Dr. Haydock admitted he had left the main room twice, once to answer a call of nature, once to check on the fireworks with the scout leader. Miss Marple did not attend the interviews. Instead, she walked slowly down the high street, stopping at the post office to buy stamps she did not need. Miss Hartnell, behind the counter, leaned forward. "Terrible business, Miss Marple. I heard it was poison. Foxglove, they say. Mrs. Price Ridley grows it in her back garden, you know." "Does she?" Miss Marple murmured. "How convenient." At the baker's shop, Mrs. Bedingfield was more forthcoming. The colonel was in a foul temper all week, said he'd caught someone out in a lie about money, threatened to go to the police. Miss Marple bought a cottage loaf and walked home. By afternoon, the suspects had crystallized in village gossip. Mr. Clement, who had quarreled publicly with the colonel over land and had bought rat poison containing digitalis compounds only last month. Lawrence Redding, who loved Lettice and was hated by her father. Lettice herself, who would inherit a tidy sum and had argued with her father that very evening about her allowance. Anne Prothero, the young second wife who had endured years of the colonel's temper and was rumored to favor Lawrence's company. The vicar, who had clashed with Prothero over a withheld donation for church repairs. Miss Marple called on Dolly Bantry at Gossington Hall, still owned by the Bantrys, though Mr. Clement rented the lodge. Dolly greeted her with red-rimmed eyes. "Jane, I can't believe it, right in our garden." Miss Marple settled into an armchair. "Did you notice anything unusual last night, Dolly dear?" Dolly thought. Anne Prothero looked quite strained before midnight, and Lawrence kept hovering near the colonel. "Also, I saw Mrs. Price Ridley near the punch bowl rather a lot. She was fussing with the ladle." Miss Marple nodded. "And the colonel himself?" "He was clutching a scrap of paper when they found him. I saw it fall out of his pocket when Dr. Haydock lifted him. I picked it up, thought it might be important. Here." She handed Miss Marple a torn fragment of notepaper. In shaky handwriting it read, "New Year, resolution, broken." Miss Marple studied it for a long moment. "Curious. Thank you, Dolly." That evening, Raymond joined his aunt for supper. Slack thinks it's Clement. The land dispute is the clearest motive. Miss Marple buttered a slice of bread. "Motives are like weeds, Raymond. There are always several. The clever thing is to notice which one was actually pulled up and used." She rose, crossed to her writing desk, and opened a small drawer. Inside lay a few oddments she had quietly collected. A used paper napkin from the party, a single foxglove petal she had picked up near the stone wall, and the torn note. Raymond watched her. "You're already working on it, aren't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One must keep one's hands busy and one's eyes open." Outside, the village lay quiet under a pale moon. Lamps glowed behind curtained windows. In the vicarage, Griselda Clement stared at her husband's back as he read his sermon notes. In the old forge, Lawrence Redding cleaned paintbrushes with unnecessary vigor. At Gossington Lodge, Mr. Clement sat alone with a glass of whiskey staring into the fire. At the vicarage, Leonard Clement locked his study door twice. And in her small sitting room, Miss Marple folded the torn note carefully, placed it back in the drawer, and picked up her knitting once more. The new year had begun, and already the threads of suspicion were weaving themselves tightly around St. Mary Mead. Somewhere among them lay the truth, and Miss Marple intended to find it. Chapter 3. Gathering Clues. The days following New Year's were unusually quiet in St. Mary Mead. The frost lingered, turning to a light snow that muffled footsteps and hushed voices. Doors remained closed longer than usual, and curtains twitched whenever anyone passed along the lanes. Murder, even when committed with the neatness of poison, casts a long shadow over a small village. Miss Marple pursued her inquiries in her customary unobtrusive way. She walked to the post office each morning, called on friends for afternoon tea, and attended the shortened Sunday service with particular attention. No one suspected that the mild old lady in the pew was storing away every glance, every hesitation, every unguarded remark. At the post office, Miss Hartnell was eager to talk. "An anonymous letter came for the Colonel last week," she confided, lowering her voice though the shop was empty. "Typed, no signature. Accused him of sharp practice in that land sale to Mr. Clement. He brought it in to show me. Furious he was." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Typed letters are always unpleasant. One wonders who would go to such trouble." "Exactly what I said, and now he's dead. Makes you think." From the baker's, Mrs. Bedingfield supplied another piece. "Colonel Prothero was in here Thursday, buying his usual seeded loaf. Told my husband he'd settle a score before the year was out. Looked grim about it. On Monday afternoon, Miss Marple took a gentle stroll past the old forge, Lawrence Redding's studio. The artist was at his easel in the window, painting a winter landscape with quick, impatient strokes. Seeing her, he wiped his hands and came to the door. "Miss Marple, I suppose the whole village is talking." "They are talking," she agreed, "but mostly guessing. May I come in for a moment? The wind is sharp today." Inside, the studio smelled of turpentine and damp canvas. Half-finished portraits leaned against the walls, including one of Lettice Prothero, dreamy and golden-haired. "A very good likeness," Miss Marple said. Lawrence flushed. "The Colonel hated it. Said it encouraged vanity. He forbade me to see her." "And yet you continued to see her?" He turned away. "We met sometimes, walks, nothing more. I'd never have harmed him, whatever people think." Miss Marple studied a small table where brushes soaked in a jar. Beside it lay a bunch of dried foxglove stems, the bell-shaped flowers long gone. "You paint from nature, I see." "Still lifes. Those were from last summer. I keep them for the seed pods. They have an interesting shape." "Quite," she murmured. "Tell me, Mr. Redding, did you notice anyone near the punch bowl just before the Colonel went outside?" He hesitated. Mrs. Price Ridley was ladling more punch, and Anne, Mrs. Prothero, passed close by, but everyone did, really. That evening, Miss Marple called at the vicarage. Griselda Clement opened the door herself, a toddler clinging to her skirts and flour on her hands from baking. "Miss Marple, do come in. Leonard's in the study, but he'll be glad to see you." The vicar emerged, looking tired. "This has been a dreadful business. The inquest is tomorrow. Natural causes won't wash, I'm afraid." They sat in the cozy sitting room. Miss Marple accepted a cup of rather strong tea. "I wondered," she said gently, "whether the Colonel had spoken to you recently about the Church Restoration Fund." The vicar's face clouded. He had promised a donation, then withdrew it suddenly. Said the plans were extravagant. We argued sharply, I fear, but it was only words," Griselda added quickly. "Leonard was out of the hall for a few minutes that night, fetching records from the car, but dozens of people were coming and going." Miss Marple noted the quick defense, the way Griselda's eyes avoided her husband's. Later, walking home through the snowy lanes, Miss Marple paused outside the Prothero house. Lights glowed behind drawn curtains. Through the window, she glimpsed Anne Prothero sitting alone by the fire, her head bowed. Lettuce was nowhere to be seen. At home, Miss Marple added to her small collection of clues. The anonymous letter, mentioned twice now, the dried foxgloves in Lawrence's studio, the vicar's brief absence, Mrs. Price Ridley's constant presence at the punch bowl. She laid the torn scrap, new, year resolution broken, on the table and studied it again under the lamp. The handwriting was shaky as though written in haste or anger. The paper was ordinary notepaper available in any stationer's. No envelope had been found. She recalled Dolly Bantry's words. The scrap had fallen from the colonel's pocket when Dr. Haydock moved him. Had he received it that night, or earlier? The next morning brought a new development. Dr. Haydock called while Miss Marple was pruning her winter jasmine. "I've been thinking about the dose," he said without preamble. It was large, larger than one might extract casually from garden leaves. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. "Someone with medical knowledge?" she asked, "or access to heart medicine?" The colonel took digitalis tablets himself. A concentrated tincture could be made from them, or from foxgloves if one knew how. Miss Marple thanked him gravely. After he left, she sat very still, her knitting idle in her lap. By afternoon, village gossip had a fresh focus. Mrs. Price Ridley's magnificent foxgloves were remembered by everyone. She had won a prize for them at the summer show, and she had been so attentive to the punch bowl. Yet Miss Marple remembered something else. Anne Prothero refilling her husband's special glass, the one with his initials, shortly before he went outside, and Lawrence Redding standing nearby, watching. The snow began to fall more thickly as evening drew in. Miss Marple closed her curtains, drew her chair closer to the fire, and took up her notebook. In neat, small handwriting, she listed times, movements, possibilities. The puzzle was taking shape, but many pieces were still missing. Red herrings abounded, jealousy, money, resentment, but the true thread lay hidden among them. Outside, the village slept uneasily under its white blanket. Somewhere a clock struck 6. Miss Marple looked up, her mild eyes thoughtful. "Soon," she said softly to the empty room. "Soon the pattern will be clear." Chapter 4, False Trails. Snow continued to fall gently over St. Mary Mead, blanketing gardens and lanes in undisturbed white. The village seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the police to name a culprit and restore the usual calm. Inspector Slack, however, was in no hurry to oblige. He tramped from house to house in heavy boots, asking the same questions again and again, growing more bad-tempered with every evasive answer. By the middle of the week, he had settled upon Mr. Clement as his chief suspect. A search of the lodge at Gossington Hall revealed an empty packet of rat poison in the garden shed, poison whose active ingredient included digitalis compounds. "Motive and means," Slack announced triumphantly to his sergeant. The colonel was pressing him hard over that boundary strip. Clement couldn't pay what was owed, so he removed the creditor. Village opinion divided sharply. Some nodded knowingly. Newcomers were always suspect. Others protested that Mr. Clement was quiet and courteous, not the murdering sort. Miss Marple, hearing both views at the WI meeting, merely smiled and continued winding wool. She paid a quiet call on Mr. Clement that afternoon. He received her in the chilly drawing room of the lodge, looking pale and strained. "This is a nightmare, Miss Marple. I bought the stuff for rats in the outhouses, nothing more. Prothero and I argued, yes, but I never wished him dead. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. Arguments over property can become heated. Did the colonel threaten legal action? He did. Said he'd take me to court after the new year, but murder? No. She noted the tremor in his hands, the way his eyes avoided the window that looked toward the main hall. Once the pantry's now empty since they had let it. A man worried about money, certainly, but a poisoner? She was not convinced. That same evening, a more dramatic development shook the village. Lettice Prothero arrived at the police station in much Benham, tearful and trembling, to make a statement. She had quarreled violently with her father on New Year's Eve, she said. He had forbidden her to see Lawrence Redding again and threatened to cut her allowance to a pittance. I told him I hated him, she sobbed. I wished he were dead. But I didn't kill him, I couldn't. Inspector Slack listened eagerly, then released her with a caution. The confession, though not of murder, added spice to the gossip. By morning, everyone knew that Lettice had practically admitted it. Lawrence Redding reacted with fury. He strode into the village hall where Slack was questioning Mrs. Price Ridley and demanded to speak. If you're hounding Lettice, you're wasting your time. She was with me most of the evening, dancing, talking. She never went near her father after their row. Slack raised an eyebrow. And where were you, Mr. Redding, between 11:45 and midnight? In the hall. Then outside briefly with Mrs. Prothero, Anne. We stepped out for air together, away from the noise. This admission caused fresh consternation. Anne Prothero and Lawrence Redding alone together just before the colonel was poisoned? The village seized upon it with delight. An affair, jealousy, a young wife and her lover removing an inconvenient husband. The plot seemed straight from a sensational novel. Anne Prothero, when questioned, confirmed the brief excursion. We only spoke for a minute or two, she said coldly. Then I returned inside. The colonel was still arguing with Mr. Clement. Miss Marple heard all these reports with quiet attention. She visited Dolly Bantry the next day and found her friend in a state of delicious indignation. An affair, Jane, right under our noses, and poison at my party. Arthur will never let me host another gathering. Miss Marple poured tea. People do form attachments, Dolly dear, but attachments do not always lead to murder. Dolly leaned forward. There's more. They found a broken pocket watch in the garden near the wall, stopped at 11:55. It must belong to the murderer, dropped in the dark. Whose is it? Miss Marple asked. No one knows yet. It's silver, quite old, initials LR engraved on the back. Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. LR. Lawrence Redding. The net seemed to tighten. That afternoon she walked past the old forge again. Lawrence was not painting. He stood in the doorway smoking, his face drawn. I've lost the watch my mother gave me, he said bitterly when she stopped. Weeks ago, anyone could have taken it. A convenient loss, she murmured. He flushed. You think I'm guilty too? I think, she said gently, that someone is trying very hard to make you appear guilty. She continued her walk, pausing at the garden wall where the colonel had been found. The snow had melted a little, revealing trampled grass and a few scattered remnants of fireworks, spent rockets, cardboard tubes. Among them lay something small and glinting. She bent stiffly and picked it up, a single cufflink, gold, with the initial CC for Clement, or for the vicar whose name was also Clement. She slipped it into her pocket. That evening, Inspector Slack called on the vicarage. Word spread quickly. Traces of foxglove leaves had been found in the vicar's shed, used for herbal experiments, Griselda explained nervously. The false trails multiplied. Mr. Clement's rat poison, Lettice's confession, Lawrence's watch, the lover's rendezvous, the vicar's foxgloves, each pointed in a different direction, yet none quite fitted. Miss Marple sat late by her fire, her notebook open. She drew small diagrams of the hall, marking where each person claimed to have been. The colonel had left at 11:50. The poison, Dr. Haydock estimated, had been taken between 11:40 and 11:50. Someone had approached him in those 10 minutes, someone he trusted enough to accept a drink from. She underlined one name twice, then crossed it out. Then another. Outside, the snow stopped falling. A pale moon silvered the roofs of St. Mary Mead. Somewhere a dog barked once, then all was silent again. The village slept, but Miss Marple did not. The pattern was there, almost visible, yet still obscured by deliberate confusion. Chapter 5. Deepening Shadows. The snow thawed slowly, turning the lanes of St. Mary Mead into muddy tracks and the gardens into sodden patches of brown and green. By the second week of January, the village had settled into an uneasy routine. Polite greetings in the post office, lowered voices in the butcher's queue, and a general agreement that the murder was a dreadful thing, best not discussed too openly. Inspector Slack, frustrated by the lack of a swift arrest, doubled his efforts. He questioned servants, searched sheds, and even interviewed the scout leader about the fireworks. Nothing new emerged. The broken watch, the rat poison, the foxglove leaves, each led nowhere conclusive. Slack began to mutter about village conspiracies and people closing ranks. Miss Marple, meanwhile, continued her quiet rounds. She called on Anne Prothero one gray afternoon, carrying a small jar of homemade blackcurrant jelly as an excuse. Anne received her in the dim drawing room of the Prothero house. Heavy curtains were half drawn, and a fire burned low. The younger woman looked pale, her elegance strained by grief and suspicion. "Thank you for coming," Anne said. "It's lonely here now. Lettice has gone to stay with an aunt in London. She couldn't bear the whispers." Miss Marple settled into a chair. "Whispers are cruel, my dear, but they pass. Tell me, did your husband mention any particular worry in the days before New Year's Eve?" Anne hesitated. He was agitated. Said he intended to change his will if Lettice persisted in seeing Lawrence. And there was something about money. Village funds, I think. He muttered about exposing someone. The Church Restoration Fund? Perhaps. He accused several people of dishonesty over the years. It became an obsession. Miss Marple noted the faint bitterness in Anne's voice. "And you and Mr. Redding, your friendship was known to the Colonel?" Anne's cheeks colored. "We were friends, nothing more. The Colonel was jealous by nature. He forbade Lawrence the house, but we met occasionally in the village. That night we stepped outside together only to escape the noise for a moment." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically and took her leave soon after, but not before noticing a small medicine bottle on the mantel. Digitalis tablets, prescribed for the Colonel's heart. That same evening, fresh trouble arose. Anonymous letters began to circulate again. One arrived at the vicarage accusing Leonard Clement of embezzling church funds. Another reached Mrs. Price Ridley, hinting that her prize foxgloves had supplied the poison. A third, delivered to Lawrence Redding, warned him to confess before it is too late. The village buzzed with renewed alarm. Poison pen letters were remembered from years past, always a sign of malice deep-rooted and personal. Miss Marple received no letter, but Dolly Bantry brought one to her the next morning, breathless with indignation. "Look at this, Jane. Delivered by hand last night. It says Arthur and I knew about the murder and hushed it up to save scandal." Miss Marple examined the typed sheet. Cheap paper, no watermark. The same typewriter, perhaps, as the note the Colonel had received. "Someone is trying to spread fear," she said calmly. "Fear clouds judgment." Dolly shivered. Who would do such a thing? Someone who feels threatened or someone who wishes to distract attention. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the old forge once more. Lawrence Redding was packing canvases into a crate. "I'm leaving, Miss Marple. Lettuce is gone. The village thinks me a murderer or worse. There's nothing to keep me here." "A wise murderer would not flee so obviously," she replied. "But an innocent man might, if goaded beyond endurance. Tell me, when did you last see your watch?" "Early December. I thought I'd lost it on a walk. Now it turns up beside a corpse. Convenient, isn't it?" "Very," she agreed, "almost too convenient." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "You believe me, then?" "I believe someone wishes me not to." She left him to his packing and continued to the garden wall where the colonel had died. The ground was soft now. Footprints from that night had long vanished. But something caught her eye. A small glass vial half buried in mud where melting snow had exposed it. She picked it up carefully with a handkerchief. Empty, but with a faint medicinal smell. The label was missing. That evening, Dr. Haydock dined with Miss Marple, an arrangement made weeks earlier and kept despite the circumstances. Over roast chicken, he spoke freely. "The dose was precise, Miss Marple, not the work of an amateur guessing with garden leaves. Someone understood dosage, perhaps someone who had watched the colonel take his tablets daily. Or someone with access to medical knowledge," she suggested. He nodded. "I've been wondering about myself. The colonel and I quarreled last autumn. He thought I'd misdiagnosed his angina and threatened to report me. Slack has asked awkward questions." Miss Marple poured him more wine. "But you were outside with the scouts when the colonel collapsed." "I was. Yet I could have administered the poison earlier. Opportunity is not proof." "Nor is motive," she said gently. Later, alone by her fire, Miss Marple added the vial to her small collection. The torn note, the foxglove petal, the cuff link, and now this. She arranged them on a tray and studied them under the lamp. The anonymous letters were the key, she felt. Not their content, but their purpose. Distraction, confusion, panic. Someone was orchestrating fear to hide a simpler truth. She recalled Mrs. Price Ridley's constant bustling at the punch bowl, Anne's careful refilling of the colonel's special glass, Lawrence lingering nearby, the vicar's brief absence, Mr. Clement's financial worry. Too many threads, all tangled deliberately. Outside, a cold wind rose, rattling the windows. Miss Marple drew her shawl closer and picked up her notebook. In small, precise handwriting, she began a new list. Not of suspects, but of small, everyday observations. Who had worn gloves that night, who had complained of the cold, who had avoided the punch, who had been seen near the garden door. The shadows were deepening, but light was beginning to glimmer at the edges. The murderer had been clever, but no one can alter human nature entirely. Somewhere in a glance or a gesture or a forgotten detail, the Jodem truth had shown itself. Miss Marple closed her notebook and looked into the fire. "Patience," she murmured. "A little more patience and the weeds will show themselves plainly." Chapter 6. Twists and Turns. The thaw turned to rain, a steady January drizzle that drummed on roofs and turned the village lanes into shallow streams. Umbrellas blossomed along the high street, and conversations took place in hurried bursts under shop awnings. The murder remained unsolved, and the anonymous letters continued to arrive, each more venomous than the last. One reached Inspector Slack himself, accusing him of incompetence and threatening exposure of past mistakes. Slack, furious, declared he would get to the bottom of the whole business if it took all winter. Miss Marple received her first letter on a Wednesday morning. It was pushed under her door before breakfast, typed, unsigned, and brief. "Old ladies who meddle meet unfortunate ends." She read it once, folded it neatly and placed it with the others in her drawer. Then she put on her mackintosh and went to call on Mrs. Price Ridley. The organizer of the fateful party was in her conservatory, potting primulas with unnecessary vigor. Her face was flushed, her manner brittle. "These letters are outrageous," she declared before Miss Marple could speak. "Someone suggested I poisoned the punch because of my foxgloves, as if I would ruin my own party." Miss Marple sat on a wicker chair. People say foolish things when they are afraid. "Did the Colonel ever mention village funds to you? You are treasurer of several committees, I believe." Mrs. Price Ridley's trowel paused. "He did question the accounts once or twice, implied there were discrepancies. I told him plainly that everything was in order and he could inspect the books whenever he wished. He never did." "Perhaps he intended to after the new year," Miss Marple suggested gently. Mrs. Price Ridley's lips tightened. "If he had, he would have found nothing. Nothing." Miss Marple thanked her and left, noting how the woman's hands had trembled slightly as she returned to her potting. That afternoon, a small breakthrough, or what seemed one, arrived. Dolly Bantry telephoned in great excitement. "Jane, the police have reconstructed the torn note." Slack showed it to Arthur. It wasn't resolution broken, it was New Year's resolution: confront the thief. The Colonel meant to expose someone for embezzlement. By evening, the village had decided the embezzler must be the vicar. Leonard Clement had access to church funds, and the Colonel had withdrawn his donation suddenly. Whispers grew that the vicar had poisoned Prothero to prevent exposure. Griselda Clement, encountering Miss Marple in the post office queue, looked close to tears. "It's unbearable, Miss Marple. Leonard is the soul of honesty, but no one believes him." Miss Marple pressed her hand. "Truth has a way of emerging, my dear. Tell me, did your husband ever borrow money from the Colonel?" Griselda hesitated. "Once, privately, when the roof needed urgent repair. He repaid it last month. The Colonel was surprisingly kind about it. A private loan, repaid." Miss Marple filed the information away. The next day brought another twist. Inspector Slack searched the vicarage again and found, hidden behind books in the study, a small bottle containing traces of foxglove tincture. Griselda swore she had never seen it. "Someone put it there," she insisted. "Someone who wants Leonard blamed." Slack was inclined to believe her. The bottle was suspiciously clean, the hiding place too obvious. But the damage was done. The vicar was asked not to take services until the matter was cleared. Miss Marple visited the vicarage that evening. Leonard Clement looked ill, his usual mildness replaced by quiet despair. "I have forgiven many things in my ministry," he said, "but being thought a murderer is hard." Miss Marple spoke soothingly of parish scandals she had known that had blown over. Privately, she noted that the study window catch was broken, easy enough for an intruder to enter. Later, walking home in the rain, she paused at the old forge. The windows were dark. Lawrence Redding had left for London 2 days earlier. His flight had convinced many of his guilt, but Miss Marple was not so sure. At home, she spread her clues on the table once more. The reconstructed note, the vial from the garden, the cufflink, the anonymous letters. She added a new item, a muddy footprint she had noticed near the vicarage study window, small and narrow, certainly not the vicar's. The embezzlement theory seemed strong, yet something jarred. The Colonel had been a bully, quick to accuse but slow to act. Would he really have waited until New Year's to confront a thief? She thought of Mrs. Price Ridley's flushed face, her vigorous denial, of Anne Prothero's quiet composure, of Mr. Clement's strained politeness, of Lawrence's bitter departure. Then she recalled a small detail from the party. Mrs. Price Ridley wearing pale kid gloves while serving punch, complaining that the cold made her fingers stiff. Gloves that might have protected her from the sticky residue of digitalis tincture. gloves that later had carried a faint, unmistakable scent of foxglove when she embraced Dolly Bantry at midnight. Miss Marple sat very still. The pattern shifted, almost clicked into place, then slipped away again. The anonymous letters were the stumbling block. They were clever, calculated to spread suspicion widely. Yet they had begun again only after the murder. Why stir more trouble if the deed was done? Unless the murderer feared the investigation was drawing too close to the truth and needed fresh confusion. She rose and went to her writing desk. From a folder she drew the original torn scrap Dolly had given her. Holding it to the lamp, she saw something she had missed before. A tiny perforation near one edge, as though it had been torn from a spiral notebook. Spiral notebooks were not common in St. Mary Mead. The vicar used one for sermon notes. Mrs. Price Ridley kept one for committee minutes. Miss Marple closed her eyes, visualizing the party once more. The circle forming, the colonel stepping out, the special glass with his initials passed from hand to hand. One pair of gloved hands had lingered longest. The rain eased to a drizzle. A church clock struck 10. Miss Marple returned her clues to the drawer, locked it carefully, and went to bed. Tomorrow she would test her growing certainty. The twists and turns had led her circuitously to a place where only one path remained clear. The murderer had been clever, but cleverness has limits. Human nature, as Miss Marple well knew, always betrays itself in the end. Chapter 7. Narrowing the Field. The rain ceased overnight, leaving St. Mary Mead washed clean under a pale January sun. Puddles reflected the sky along the lanes and smoke rose straight from cottage chimneys. For the first time in weeks, the village felt almost normal, until one remembered that a murderer still walked freely among its residents. Miss Marple spent the morning in her garden, tying up straggling chrysanthemums and noting which plants had survived the frost. Gardening, she often said, cleared the mind wonderfully. By noon, her thoughts had arranged themselves with satisfying neatness. She began with a visit to Dr. Haydock. Over a cup of coffee in his surgery, he confirmed what she had suspected. The colonel's own digitalis tablets are missing from the bottle on his dressing table. Anne Prothero noticed it only yesterday. 10 or 12 would have made a lethal dose when dissolved. Enough to poison the contents of a single glass? Easily. Added to punch, the taste would be masked by fruit and sugar. Miss Marple thanked him and continued to the village hall, where Mrs. Price Ridley was supervising the cleaning after a WI meeting. "I wondered," Miss Marple said mildly, "whether you still have the gloves you wore on New Year's Eve, the pale kid ones. I believe you mentioned they were stained." Mrs. Price Ridley stiffened. "I threw them away, punched stains dreadfully, and there was a tear in one finger." "A pity," Miss Marple murmured. "Stains can sometimes be removed." She left Mrs. Price Ridley looking unsettled and walked to the vicarage. Griselda greeted her with relief. "Leonard has been asked to resume services on Sunday. Slack seems to accept that the tincture bottle was planted." Miss Marple sat in the study where the bottle had been found. She examined the window catch more closely. Definitely forced from outside. On the floor beneath the sill lay a single pale thread caught on a splinter. Kid leather, almost certainly. "Someone entered here recently," she said. "Someone wearing light gloves." Griselda paled. "The anonymous letters. Do you think the same person?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that the letters and the planted evidence served the same purpose, to scatter suspicion widely." That afternoon she called on Anne Prothero again. The house felt emptier without lettuce. Only a daily woman came in now. Anne poured tea with steady hands. "Lawrence has written from London. He asks me to join him there when this is over. And will you?" "Perhaps. There is nothing to keep me here now." Miss Marple sipped her tea. The Colonel's special glass, the one with his initials, where is it kept? In the kitchen cupboard with the best glasses. It was his habit to use only that one for parties. So anyone in the hall that night might have had access to it before the evening began? Anne considered. I suppose so. Mrs. Price Ridley helped me wash glasses earlier in the day. She was very insistent on everything being perfect. Miss Marple nodded and changed the subject to the weather, but her mind was busy. By evening, she had narrowed the possibilities to 2, then to 1. The motive was not the grand one everyone supposed, no passionate affair, no large embezzlement, but something smaller, more petty, and therefore more believable. Colonel Prothero had discovered that Mrs. Price Ridley had been siphoning small sums from various village funds over several years. Not enough to ruin her, but enough to disgrace her utterly in a place like St. Mary Mead, where reputation was everything. He had confronted her privately before Christmas, giving her until the new year to make restitution. His resolution was to expose her at the party if she failed to comply. Mrs. Price Ridley, proud and domineering, could not bear the thought of public humiliation. She had access to the Colonel's glass during preparations. She knew his heart condition. She grew foxgloves in abundance. The plan was simple. Dissolve tablets in the glass, serve punch throughout the evening, ensure the Colonel received his special one near midnight, then watch the excitement mask his collapse. The anonymous letters and planted evidence were insurance, meant to confuse any investigation. The torn note had been written by the Colonel himself in haste, perhaps slipped into his pocket as a reminder. Mrs. Price Ridley had not known of it until later, then tried to use similar letters to spread panic. Miss Marple sat by her fire that night, knitting steadily. Only one detail remained to confirm. She telephoned Dolly Bantry. "Dolly, dear, do you remember Mrs. Price Ridley embracing you at midnight? Did you notice anything about her gloves?" Dolly thought. "Yes, now you mention it, they smelled rather strongly of foxglove. I thought she'd been arranging flowers." "Thank you, Dolly. That is most helpful." The next morning, Miss Marple walked to the police station in Much Benham. Inspector Slack received her with ill-concealed impatience. "I've no time for old ladies' fancies today, Miss Marple." "Quite," she said serenely. "But I believe I can tell you who poisoned Colonel Prothero." Slack stared, then grudgingly offered her a chair. She explained quietly. The special glass, the missing tablets, the forced window, the thread, the scent on the gloves, the petty but devastating motive. Slack listened, his skepticism turning to reluctant attention. "We'll need proof," he said at last. "There will be proof," Miss Marple replied. "Search her dustbin for the discarded gloves, and check her committee account books carefully. Small discrepancies over several years." Slack stood. "I'll do that. Though if you're wrong—" "I am not wrong," she said gently. She left him issuing orders and walked home through the crisp air. The sun was setting, gilding the church spire. St. Mary Mead looked peaceful again, as though nothing darker than a missed stitch in knitting had ever disturbed it. But Miss Marple knew better. Villages held secrets the way gardens held weeds, quietly, persistently, until someone took the trouble to look closely. She reached her gate, paused to deadhead a late rose, and went inside to put the kettle on. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, confession, relief. Tonight there was only the satisfaction of a puzzle nearly solved. Chapter 8. The Vital Clue. The pale January sun gave way to a sharp frost overnight, silvering the roofs of St. Mary Mead once more. Inspector Slack, spurred by Miss Marple's quiet certainty, obtained a warrant and searched Mrs. Price Ridley's house from attic to cellar. In a dustbin at the back, wrapped in newspaper at the bottom, he found the pale kid gloves, stained faintly with punch and carrying, even now, the unmistakable bitter scent of foxglove. In her desk drawer lay the spiral notebook from which the colonel's torn reminder had come. Several pages had been roughly removed, and in a locked cash box in the wardrobe were the committee account books, showing small but regular discrepancies stretching back 3 years. Sums carefully transferred to a private account in Mrs. Price Ridley's name. Confronted with the evidence in her own sitting room, Mrs. Price Ridley held out for nearly an hour. She spoke of careless bookkeeping, of gloves discarded for ordinary reasons, of foxgloves being common garden plants. But when Slack produced the dissolved residue from the fingertips of the gloves, digitalis crystals identified by the police laboratory, her defiance crumbled. She sat very straight in her high-backed chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It was never meant to be murder," she said at last, her voice thin and precise. "Only to silence him. He had discovered the irregularities. He gave me until the new year to repay every penny, or he would tell the entire village. Exposure would have ruined me. I could not bear the humiliation." Miss Marple, invited by Slack to witness the interview, sat quietly in the corner, her knitting idle for once. Mrs. Price Ridley continued, almost as though reciting a lesson. "I knew about his heart. Everyone did. I had helped prepare the glasses that afternoon. It was simple to take a few of his tablets from the bottle in the bathroom cabinet when Anne was downstairs. I dissolved them in a little water and added the liquid to his special glass. Then I served punch all evening, making sure he received that one near the end. When he stepped outside for air, the cold and excitement did the rest. It seemed merciful almost. Quick." "And the anonymous letters?" Slack asked gruffly. "To confuse matters, I typed them on the old machine at the Women's Institute. No one would trace it. The planted tincture at the vicarage, the watch I took from Lawrence's studio when he was out, all to spread suspicion. I thought if everyone was accused, no one would be believed guilty." Miss Marple spoke for the first time softly. "You overlooked small things, my dear. The scent on your gloves when you embraced Dolly at midnight. The thread caught in the vicarage window. And most of all, you underestimated how much one notices in a village." Mrs. Price Ridley turned to her, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I have organized every fete, every sale, every gathering for 20 years. I could not let it all be taken away by that bullying man." Slack closed his notebook. "Esther Price Ridley, I am arresting you for the murder of Colonel Lucius Prothero." The formal words sounded strangely loud in the neat, orderly room. Mrs. Price Ridley rose without assistance, smoothing her skirt with habitual precision. Only the slightest tremor in her fingers betrayed her. As she was led away, Miss Marple followed at a distance. Outside, a small knot of villagers had gathered, drawn by the police car. Whispers rippled through them as Mrs. Price Ridley appeared between two constables. Shock, disbelief, then a slow acceptance. The organizer, the busybody, the pillar of respectability, capable of poison. Dolly Bantry arrived breathless, having seen the car from her window. "Jane, is it true? Mrs. Price Ridley?" Miss Marple nodded. "It is true, Dolly dear. Pride is a terrible thing when it turns to fear." That evening the village lights seemed to burn a little brighter, as though a shadow had lifted. Lawrence Redding telephoned from London to say he would return the next day. Anne Prothero was seen closing curtains without drawing them fully, letting in the moonlight for the first time since the murder. At the vicarage, Griselda sang as she prepared supper. Miss Marple sat by her own fireside, knitting once more. The pink baby jacket was nearly finished. She thought of Mrs. Price Ridley alone now in a police cell, facing the ruin she had tried so desperately to avoid. "Human nature," she murmured to the quiet room. "So predictable and yet so sad." Outside, the frost glittered under a clear sky full of stars. St. Mary Mead slept more peacefully than it had for weeks, though a new caution had entered its gentle rhythm. One learned, eventually, that no one was quite what they seemed, not even the most respectable organizer of village festivities. The vital clue had been found, the puzzle completed. Tomorrow there would be explanations over tea and the slow return to ordinary life. Tonight there was only the soft click of needles and the knowledge that justice, though tardy, had arrived. Chapter 9. The Revelation. A week after Mrs. Price Ridley's arrest, the frost returned with a vengeance, turning St. Mary Mead into a glittering world of white rime. The village had begun to heal. Curtains were drawn back. Voices in the shop sounded lighter, and the scandal, though still discussed in lowered tones, no longer carried the sharp edge of fear. Miss Marple, however, felt that one final gathering was needed, not for drama, but for clarity. Loose ends, she believed, should be neatly tied before being put away. She suggested to Dolly Bantry that the remaining guests from the New Year's Eve party be invited to the village hall on a Saturday afternoon, ostensibly for a quiet tea to lay the matter to rest. Inspector Slack, though grumbling, agreed to attend. Word spread quickly. No one wished to miss the occasion. The hall looked much as it had on the fateful night, though daylight now streamed through the windows and the decorations had long been removed. A long table was laid with Dolly's best cups and saucers, plates of scones and Victoria sponge, and a large teapot keeping warm under a embroidered cozy. The guests arrived promptly. Dr. Haydock, the vicar and Griselda, Anne Prothero in quiet grey, Lawrence Redding newly returned from London, Mr. Clement looking relieved, and even Colonel Bantry, who rarely attended such gatherings but had been persuaded by his wife. Miss Marple sat in her usual unobtrusive corner, knitting placidly. When everyone had been served tea and the initial awkward conversation about the weather had subsided, she laid down her needles and spoke in her gentle, precise voice. "I am glad you could all come. There have been so many rumors and half-truths these past weeks that I thought it only fair to explain exactly what happened on New Year's Eve." All eyes turned to her. Inspector Slack, standing by the door, folded his arms but said nothing. Miss Marple continued calmly. "Colonel Prothero was poisoned with a concentrated dose of digitalis, his own heart tablets, dissolved and added to the special glass he always used. The poison was administered between 11:40 and 11:50, just before he stepped outside for air. The cold and excitement hastened the effect, so that he collapsed almost immediately after midnight." She paused to sip her tea. Many motives were suggested. Land disputes, forbidden romance, inheritance, even embezzlement on a grand scale. These were encouraged by anonymous letters and planted evidence. Mr. Redding's watch, the tincture in the vicarage, all were intended to confuse. Lawrence shifted uncomfortably. Anne kept her gaze on her cup. "The true motive," Miss Marple said, "was simpler and, in its way, more tragic. Mrs. Price Ridley had, over several years, taken small sums from the committees she controlled. Not large amounts, enough to supplement a comfortable income, no more. Colonel Prothero discovered this shortly before Christmas. He confronted her privately and gave her until the new year to repay every penny, failing which he would expose her publicly." A murmur ran around the table. Griselda looked shocked. The vicar merely saddened. Mrs. Price Ridley could not face the disgrace. On the afternoon of the party, she helped prepare glasses at the Prothero house. It was easy to slip into the bathroom, take tablets from the bottle, and later dissolve them into the colonel's marked glass. She served punch throughout the evening, ensuring that glass reached him near the end. When he went outside, she believed the symptoms would be taken for a natural heart attack. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. "It very nearly was." Miss Marple smiled faintly. But small things betrayed her. The scent of foxglove on her gloves when she embraced Dolly at midnight, foxglove she had handled while preparing the tincture as a backup. The pale thread caught in the vicarage window after she planted false evidence. The discarded gloves stained and hastily hidden. And above all, her constant presence at the punch bowl, fussing and ladling, when no one had asked her to serve at all. Anne Prothero spoke for the first time. But the anonymous letters, why continue them after the murder? To keep suspicion scattered, Miss Marple replied. She feared the investigation might still turn toward her. Pride, you see, is a powerful force. It drove her to murder and then to desperate measures to conceal it. Silence fell. Outside, a light snow began to drift past the windows. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. Mrs. Price Ridley has confessed fully. The case is closed. Dolly Bantry dabbed her eyes. To think it was her all along. She organized everything, fates, concerts, the Christmas bazaar. Which gave her control of the funds, Miss Marple said gently. And opportunity. Lawrence reached for Anne's hand across the table. She let him take it. Mr. Clement gave a small, relieved sigh. The vicar murmured something about forgiveness. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. Villages are like gardens. Most plants are harmless, even beneficial. But occasionally a weed takes hold. Pretty on the surface, poisonous underneath. One must notice it early and deal kindly but firmly. The gathering broke up soon after. Thanks were murmured, hands pressed. As the guests departed into the softly falling snow, the hall felt cleansed, the air lighter. Dolly lingered to help clear cups. Jane, you were wonderful, but how did you know it was her? Miss Marple smiled. I have known many Mrs. Price Ridleys in my life, Dolly dear. They organize, they dominate, they cannot bear to be thought less than perfect. When threatened, they strike out, quietly, efficiently, and with terrible thoroughness. Outside, the village lay hushed under its new blanket of snow. Footprints from the hall led away in different directions. Toward the vicarage, the old forge, Gossington Lodge, the Prothero house. Life would resume its gentle rhythm. Chapter 10. Morning Tea and Resolution. A fortnight later, on a bright February morning when the first snowdrops were pushing through the thawed earth, Miss Marple invited a small circle to tea at her cottage. The scandal had faded into the background of village life. Mrs. Price Ridley had been quietly committed for trial, and St. Mary Mead preferred now to speak of spring plantings and the upcoming church fete. Dolly Bantry arrived first, flushed from the walk and full of news. Jane, you'll never believe it. Lawrence Redding has proposed to Anne Prothero and she has accepted. They plan a quiet wedding in London and will live there. Lettice is delighted she's to stay with them part of the year. Miss Marple smiled as she poured tea. I am glad. They suit each other far better than the Colonel ever suited Anne. Dr. Haydock came next, stamping snow from his boots. A happy ending for someone at least, though I still can't quite believe it of Mrs. Price Ridley. The vicar and Griselda followed soon after, bringing a bunch of early narcissi from the vicarage garden. Griselda, radiant as always, settled beside Miss Marple. We are so grateful, Miss Marple. Leonard's name is completely cleared and the parish has been wonderfully kind. Leonard Clement nodded gravely. I confess I came close to despair. To be suspected of such a thing. Miss Marple handed him a cup. Suspicion falls heavily on the innocent, but it passes. You have emerged stronger. Lawrence and Anne arrived last, arm in arm, looking younger than they had in months. Anne's morning gray had been replaced by soft blue, and Lawrence's face had lost its strained lines. We came to thank you, Anne said simply. Without your quiet persistence, the wrong person might have suffered. Miss Marple waved the thanks away. I only noticed what was there to be noticed. Tell me, have you plans for the house? We shall sell it, Lawrence replied. Too many memories. Mr. Clement has made an offer for the lodge as well. He and the Bantrys have come to an amicable arrangement about the land. Dolly beamed. Arthur is relieved beyond words. No more boundary quarrels. Tea was poured and refilled. Plates of buttered scones, strawberry jam, and Miss Marple's feather-light sponge cake circulated. Conversation flowed gently, from wedding plans to the new curate, from the mild winter to the promise of an early spring. At length, Dolly could contain herself no longer. But Jane, do tell us, how did you know it was Mrs. Price Ridley? We were all so certain it was Lawrence or the vicar or poor Mr. Clement. Miss Marple set down her cup and considered. It was a matter of observing character, Dolly dear. In villages one sees people clearly over years. Mrs. Price Ridley had always needed to be first, to organize, to direct, to be admired. When the colonel threatened that position with exposure, even over quite small sums, she could not endure it. Pride, you see, can be more dangerous than greed or passion. She paused, looking around the cozy room at their attentive faces. The clues were small ones. Her unnecessary fussing at the punch bowl, the scent on her gloves, the discarded pair hidden rather than simply washed, the forced window at the vicarage, the spiral notebook pages. Each in itself meant little, but together they pointed unmistakably. Dr. Haydock chuckled. And the rest of us supplied the red herrings without knowing it. My quarrel with the colonel, Lawrence's watch, the vicar's loan. Exactly, Miss Marple said. The murderer used our ordinary human complications to create confusion. But complications untangle when one is patient. Anne leaned forward. And the torn note? New year? Resolution? The colonel's own reminder to himself, written hastily and pocketed. Mrs. Price Ridley knew nothing of it until later, then tried to imitate the idea with her anonymous letters. That was her mistake. Over-elaboration. Griselda shivered slightly. It's frightening to think such calculation existed behind her brisk smile. Yet also pitiable, Miss Marple replied softly. She has lost everything she valued most: position, respect, freedom. A high price for pride. The fire crackled comfortably. Outside, a robin sang from the apple tree. Lawrence raised his cup. To Miss Marple, quietest and sharpest detective in England. Embarrassed laughter greeted this, and Miss Marple shook her head. I am only an old lady who knits and notices things, but I am glad the village is at peace again. One by one, the guests departed into the pale sunshine. Dolly to Gossington Hall, the Clements to the vicarage, Lawrence and Anne to begin packing the Prothero house. Promises of future visits and wedding invitations lingered in the air. Miss Marple stood at her gate seeing them off, then returned to her sitting room. She gathered the empty cups, straightened the cushions, and finally sat once more with her knitting. The pink baby jacket was finished now, ready for the vicar's expected child. She folded it neatly and laid it aside. Outside, the snowdrops nodded in the border, and the first mild breeze of approaching spring stirred the bare branches. St. Mary Mead had weathered another storm. Life resumed its gentle, predictable rhythm. Tea parties, garden planning, small kindnesses, and smaller quarrels. And in her cottage by the lane, Miss Marple knitted on, eyes mild, mind alert, ready for whatever puzzle human nature might present next. For in villages, as she often reflected, there is always something interesting just beneath the surface, if one takes the trouble to look.